Hi everyone, thank you for joining today. My name is MaryJane Proulx and I'm a research assistant for CIOOS Atlantic Regional Association. For the past 8 weeks, I've been researching and writing about the digitization of traditional ecological knowledge. Today I'm here to talk about some of my work and findings throughout the research process, including the results of a literature review written for CIOOS Atlantic. CIOOS Atlantic respectfully acknowledges its work in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of Mi'kmaq people, and the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk. I would also like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatukavut and the Innu as the original people of Labrador. CIOOS Atlantic recognizes that the Indigenous people of the Atlantic seaboard are the original stewards and caretakers of these lands and waters. Before we get started, I wanted to give a brief outline of some of the things I'm going to be chatting about today. So to start, I'm going to give an introduction about myself, an introduction to the project and how the literature review got started. We're going to go through some literature review objectives, research processes, resources explored, key components including themes and challenges, the literature review structure, and then finally key findings. So I figured to start off I would just give a brief introduction about myself and talk about how I got involved with CIOOS Atlantic. My name is MaryJane and I'm located and have lived in Nogo-Jiwanong, otherwise known as Peterborough, most of my life. Peterborough is about an hour and a half north of Toronto, Ontario. My mom's side of the family is Mississauga-Nishnabek and my dad's side of the family is Scottish. So why am I in this line of work? For one, it really started with public school. I think public school was a bit of a culture shock as some of the teachings and values that I was learning at home didn't always mix with what I was learning in school. This became especially apparent in high school, in history and science classes where I was learning about the potato famine and European history, but not about the land where I lived. So this drove me to pursue history in university. And as history and the environment are so naturally intertwined in Anishinaabe culture, I also majored in environmental resource studies and minored in Indigenous environmental science. In university, I also began volunteering at the Canadian Canoe Museum, as I love being in canoes and out on the water. And later that year, I began working as an artisan interpreter, teaching visitors about Indigenous settler relations through the story of the canoe. After university, I went to college and took ecosystem management technology to learn more hands-on fieldwork skills. And currently, I'm in the museum management and curatorship program and will be heading out to Haida Gwaii in a couple of weeks for an internship. So primarily, my passion lies with Indigenous settler relations and bridging cultures, whether that be through museum work and storytelling or environmental fieldwork and working with different knowledge systems. So a little bit of project background and how this literature review got started. Indigenous engagement has been a huge priority for CIOOS Atlantic. CIOOS is still in its very early stages of development, and because of this, CIOOS has had the opportunity to consult with and receive feedback from many different Indigenous communities across Atlantic Canada, and will continue to do so going forward. With this, it is recognized that traditional ecological knowledge is very unique, and it's very unique between different communities. CIOOS had secured funding from the Ocean Frontier Institute to learn more about traditional ecological knowledge and the best practices for incorporating or working with traditional ecological knowledge in a respectful way. So that's a bit of a brief intro to how the literature review got started. I was hired in June of 2020 to initiate this research and really explore the digitization of traditional knowledge, some of the different concerns, and some of the factors that have made different projects successful. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in the next slide with the literature review objectives. So these are the different literature review objectives. Objective 1, to reveal cases where traditional ecological knowledge has been collected, digitized, and the metadata made open under some or all of the FAIR data principles. The FAIR principles being findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. Objective 2 is to identify the important enabling factors that notably contributed to successful outcomes. And Objective 3, to identify and explore any risks and limitations with the digitization of TEEC and provide recommendations for CIOOS Atlantic to consider based on the resources investigated. So the first two objectives were developed by CIOOS Atlantic prior to me arriving, whereas the last objectives was really developed once I began researching. So as I started researching about digitizing TEEC, a lot of concerns became apparent regarding the risks and limitations. So this objective really became important for acknowledging some of these risks. So the research process. This is a walkthrough of the research process for my literature review. in the most concise way I could fit all into one slide. So phase 1 was mostly onboarding and orientation. For me, living in Ontario, this included familiarizing myself with the Atlantic seaboard and the traditional territories. CIOOS and Pisces had also provided literature for review about best engagement practices for working respectfully with Indigenous communities. So during phase 1, I was looking through a lot of these resources as well. After that, I dove into different digitization literature and projects about making teak available online. Phase 2 was developing a framework for the literature review based on the sources I had explored, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in the next slide. And then phase 3, I really began writing. A lot of it came out naturally as I already had so many resources to explore and look at, but at the same time there was a lot of voices missing and questions that I had. So my primary questions became, what do these Atlantic communities want, and what are their data needs? And I think that once we begin to answer these questions, CIOOS Atlantic will be better able to progress further in a way that is reciprocal and meaningful. So this became a reoccurring theme throughout the entire literature review. Phase 4 was really about making this 41-page lengthy, wordy literature review digestible for anyone that wanted to read it. So this presentation is one result of that, but also a one-page summary. So throughout the research process and while I was writing the literature review, there was a lot of different resources that I explored that went beyond just literature. I looked at different scholarly sources, including both Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholarship on the digitization of traditional ecological knowledge. These were really helpful for gaining a better understanding of why some people oppose the digitization of traditional ecological knowledge, but also gaining a better understanding of some of the methods for digitizing knowledge systems, if that's the route that CIOOS Atlantic is going to pursue, along with the different communities involved. I also looked at different databases as primary sources, and most of these were participatory geographic projects in the north. So a lot of Arctic communities are working with universities and institutions to map out their knowledge and create these beautiful interactive atlases with different audio and oral components. So these were really useful for actually looking at physical examples of digitized teak. A lot of the projects were in the north, but that's not to say that there aren't other digitization projects being done out there. These were just the ones that were most readily available and accessible for me to look at, which is why I exemplify them in my literature review. Some other resources that I explored were primarily discussion and conversation based. So the engagement team at CIOOS Atlantic is continually reaching out to different key partners and different communities, other experts in the field to really learn about this process of digitizing knowledge, and also to learn about other collaboration projects between Indigenous communities and organizations that don't necessarily prioritize digitizing TEK. Lastly, I have on there documentaries, and these I actually should have put more on the start of that slide, as they were really preliminary to gaining a better historical and geographic context about the Atlantic seaboard. So I watched some documentaries on environmental racism and traditional ecological knowledge and different oral history videos from the area, and that was just really useful for orienting myself before I started writing. This slide shows a quick snapshot of the CARE principle movement and the CIOOS Atlas. Intellectual property ownership and decontextualization are two major themes that reoccurred throughout my research. The FAIR data principles need to be carefully considered when making sensitive data openly accessible and available. Where is the data going? What is it being used for? Out of this concern, the CARE principles were developed by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. This became an important consideration to address throughout my literature review. The image to the right is a screenshot of the CIOOS Atlas. The CIOOS Atlas is an interactive map that is free and accessible online. The CIOOS Atlas has data points that allow users to learn about the cultural and ecological significance of the area. Oral and audio components from Inuit knowledge holders were added to keep the traditional transmission of knowledge alive. Passing on knowledge without being on the land is a concern because it can take away from the important geographic context that makes Indigenous knowledge systems unique. To combat this, a lot of cartographic atlases have added audio and visual components in an attempt to keep knowledge transmission alive. Most examples of digitized teak have been participatory mapping projects with elders and knowledge holders in northern coastal communities. A key component that was missing from this research was the voice of Atlantic Indigenous communities to understand how these concerns resonate. Community-based projects were explored as an alternative to digitizing traditional ecological knowledge, as some communities may not be comfortable with making their knowledge readily accessible. Out of my research, the structure of the literature review flowed pretty naturally based on the recurring themes and concerns about digitizing teak. This slide goes through the headings and subheadings of the literature review. Geographic context talks a lot about the localized nature of teak and how it cannot really be defined because Indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge is so unique to each community. Historical context highlights briefly some trauma and past research practices that are good to be aware of. Some of these practices include misuse of data, failure to have consent for data sharing, and just general unethical behavior shown by researchers of the past. This is not to place blame, but instead to create consciousness on why some communities may be reluctant to want to participate in projects with institutions or universities. Two-Eyed Seeing talks about integrative science and some of the benefits of collaboration. Methodology explores specific resources, which includes databases, community-based projects, and decision-making between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. Challenges was a large section that focused on some of the risks of digitizing teak. Recommendations were more key findings, as I could not recommend to digitize or not digitize traditional knowledge, as it is not my place. What I could recommend was value-based processes. This includes ethical engagement, co-developing goals, and being aware of community protocols. Future research was basically the things I couldn't get to, or things that required a little bit more work. For example, CIOOS Atlantic may be interested in forming their own land acknowledgement that encompasses the traditional territories of Atlantic Indigenous communities. Here are some key findings from my literature review that I thought would be important to highlight. There is not a one-size-fits-all approach to partnering with Indigenous communities. As CIOOS Atlantic begins to connect more with Indigenous communities, research objectives should be co-developed and reciprocal. Historical and geographic context is important for understanding local situations. One of the most important components that was really missing from my literature review was the voice of Atlantic Indigenous communities to get a better understanding of the data needs of these communities. I think that will be a key breakthrough in advancing meaningful relationships. Although CIOOS does not actively collect data, the platform does provide a space for data collectors. Care should be taken to ensure that the data CIOOS houses has been collected ethically. And finally, and the most relative to my literature review objectives, the risks associated with digitizing teak need to be fully understood. This includes paying close attention to intellectual property ownership, decontextualization, and unique community concerns. With this, mitigation measures should be put in place to avoid the exploitation and misuse of traditional knowledge systems. So this concludes the end of my presentation. I want to thank you for joining and listening, whether you're a partner organization, a community member, or just interested in this line of work. My journey with CIOOS has been incredibly rewarding. I've had the opportunity to dive into different collaborative approaches for ocean observing communities. I've also had the opportunity to spend the last 8 weeks working with such kind people who genuinely care about making meaningful reciprocal relationships with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. This being said, if you're interested in learning more about CIOOS Atlantic or becoming a potential partner, please don't hesitate to reach out. I've included the contact information here on the slide. Thank you again for listening and have a great day. Chi miigwech.